From challenging the traditional narrative to the internal social political landscape of Germany, we're joined by an expert to help answer how Germany lost the First World War. Dr. Holger Afflerbach, author of On the Knife Edge, How Germany Lost the First World War, and the Distinguished Chair of Modern European History at the University of Leeds, helps answer our questions today.
I started to work on the First World War when I was a PhD student, because I made my PhD in Germany. You can hear it in my English. Of course, I'm German. And I studied at the University of Düsseldorf. And as all students of history, there is an infinite number of potential research topics. And I had a hard time to decide between late antiquity and modern history. And then suddenly I had the idea to work on Erich von Falkenhayn. It was like a lightning coming to me. So I saw a book, I had an idea, and I decided to work on Erich von Falkenhayn. And for the English audience, Erich von Falkenhayn is a figure of the First World War, probably comparable with Douglas Haig. So head, not like the head of the British Expeditionary Force. Falkenhayn was German Chief of Staff from 1914 to 1916 and was responsible for the German strategy. And the battle which is remembered most is the Battle of Verdun. Of course, the ill-fated Battle of Verdun. So his name is linked to Verdun, but he had also much more successful battles, like, for example, Gorlice-Tarnów, which are completely forgotten. Nobody ever heard the name of the Battle of Gorlice-Tarnów, despite the fact that Gorlice-Tarnów was an extremely important battle. Well, that is how I started. So I made my PhD. My PhD was successful because I could find unknown documents, so exchange of letters of Falkenhayn, which were unknown. So I was very lucky with my archival researches. And so I could continue. And then I started my habilitation in Germany. This is a second book you have to write to become professor. And then I went to Austria, and then I went to the United States of America, and then I came here, and I always focused on international relations and the history of war. And at some point, I came back to the First World War and decided to link my research on Falkenhayn, a later research on Wilhelm II in the First World War, and to write a comprehensive book on German strategy, but strategy understood in the sense of what does a German society want to achieve by the war. That was basically the question. And I was aware that there's probably not one answer, but you have to go through the entire war and all these ups and downs. And it's quite complex. And I was aided by that because I had edited several sources from the general headquarters, which were diaries. So basically going through the First World War day by day, the entire 1500 days or what it was, going through the entire war day by day. And for that reason, I was well prepared to write this book where I really could go through the entire war day by day. Of course, I did not do that in the book, in the writing, but to show the ups and downs.
You obviously spoke about how kind of what you studied naturally kind of led you to focus on a bigger narrative. But what then kind of directed you to challenge the narrative of Germany's commitment to an all-out kind of conquest during the First World War, which is usually the assumption, which is Germany is committed to just total war and that's all that they're bothered in. But why did you want to challenge that traditional perspective?
Before I answer that, maybe we should bring one name into the debate, and this name is Fritz Fischer. this is now a question. I don't know how well the name Fritz Fischer is known to the British audience, but he was a German historian who wrote a big book on Germany's war aims during the First World War, which was published in 1961, and which started the so-called Fischer controversy. And this went on for years in Germany. And the central question is, was Imperial Germany embarking on a war of conquest? And after Fritz Fischer published his book, research always went in this direction to say that Imperial Germany had very far-reaching aims of continental hegemony. And the key argument for him is the so-called September program from 1940, which he found somewhere in an East German archive. And he amassed a lot of documents to a lot of plans of conquest, and said Imperial Germany was a kind of imperialist machine and wanted to achieve European domination. And in this period of time, it was even worse than it sounds now, because then you could make an immediate link with Nazi Germany and saying Imperial Germany was practically trying to do the same like Hitler, conquering Europe. And for that reason, also the contemporaries were so against that. So it was a ferocity. It was a very ferocious debate. Now it's more than 100 years ago, and we are calmer now, and we can speak about something long ago. But for them, it was part of their own life. Okay, Fischer light will say a milder version of what Fischer said is probably still dominant. So I agree with you, Amar. This is basically what people think. Imperial Germany was embarking on a war of conquest. And I think this is only a part of the truth, and the truth is much more complex. This means I don't deny that there is an avalanche of, if you go to the archives, you find a lot of plans for German conquest, but the question is, how relevant were they? And also, is that the entire story, or was, for example, Germany also trying to get out of the war, let's say, without conquering anything? And we can see that in the second part of the war, this is pretty much what they tried. They tried to get somehow out of the war. The German society was not interested in big conquests. Some people always were, but there was also a strong peace party which favored a compromise peace with the Allied powers. And that, basically, this feeling that something is unbalanced. And unbalanced, unbalanced is not exactly the same like being wrong, but unbalanced. I had the strong feeling, the overwhelmingly strong feeling, that here is something very unbalanced and I have to straighten that out. This made me write this book.
No, thank you for that. I completely appreciate that answer, because it makes perfect sense of why you would wish to take on that narrative and actually where it originates from. And I wasn't aware of the Fischer controversy, was something which is obviously quite interesting. Just then, kind of looking at your book overall, it suggests that the outcome of the First World War remained in the balance until relatively later on in the conflict. Could you elaborate on some of the turning points that ultimately lead to Germany's defeat? And could you also kind of illustrate how it wasn't inevitable for Germany to lose? Because I think looking back now, a lot of people sometimes would just assume Germany was always going to lose the First World War, whereas I think at the time things may have not necessarily predicted what the outcomes would have been.
Yes, and I fully agree with you. I would say a vast majority of people who think about the First World War think that Germany had, if at all, one bet. Will say the winning the Marne battle, kicking the French out of the war, then maybe it would have gone right for Germany. And after losing the Marne battle in September 1914, Germany was done. and unfortunately needed 4 years to understand that. I'm not of that opinion, because there are a lot of turning points, smaller and bigger turning points. For example, a smaller turning point, which normally gets zero attention, is that first the Germans and Austrians won a major battle against the Russians, this battle of Gorlitz and Tarnów, which brought the entire Russian front into a kind of, hasty retreat. They had to give up the entirety of Russian Poland to save the army. So this was already, we'll say, the first step towards the Russian collapse in 1917. And the war could have gone already in the way of the Central Powers if Italy had not entered the war in May 1915 and counterbalanced it. Because everything from the Marne battle until 1917 was a European stalemate. And one of my central ideas is this war was impossible to decide. We'll say they were in a stalemate, and the stalemate was hopeless, and they tried really hard. For example, the Somme battle in 1916, which was a coordinated attack between the British, the French, the Russians, and the Italians, and they had agreed to attack all at the same moment, to squeeze the Central Powers and hope that the defense line will break somewhere. And it failed. And I think the powers in Europe, would say the opposing camps, were too equal, not 100% equal, but too equal to allow a military success. And then we had to make that even more complicated. The Central Powers were more successful on the battlefield. Look on any map of the First World War, they were fighting practically everywhere on enemy soil. They had pushed back the Russians. They were fighting in northern France. They had conquered more than 80% of Belgium, and they were successful, and the Allied powers were unable to match that properly. On the other hand, the German and Austro-Hungarian home front was weak because of the nutrition problems and so on. And the real turning point of the war, and this is now something completely unoriginal, is in my eyes 1st of February 1917. On this day, Germany declared unlimited submarine warfare, and the Americans, they had already done that in 1915, but then the Lusitania was sunk, Americans lost their life, the United States of America protested, Germany revoked the measure. So they had stopped that in 1915. And on the 1st of February 1917, they had resumed the unlimited submarine warfare, and this brought the Americans in. And this is now completely unoriginal, because many people would say that, but I cannot contradict them, because it is true. The European stalemate was broken by the Americans. And without the Americans intervening, this kind of stalemate would have continued. And I don't know for how long. And I think the most natural outcome of the European stalemate would have been at some point a political compromise. Because what can you do if you fight and fight and fight and fight and you don't come to a conclusion? At some point you have to settle. By the way, this is something which we may experience in Ukraine as well, that you don't find, there is no solution on the battlefield. At some point, people understand that, and then you have to sit down. And this is also another topic of my book, sitting down and trying to find a political compromise, which the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, and we have to mention also Bulgaria and the Ottoman Turkey, tried to do. First with secret diplomacy, they tried to broker separate pieces, And all that did not work. Then they made an official peace offer in December 1916. Research says normally, well, this is only for the domestic audience to show that we are the good guys. We try to achieve peace, but in reality, they want to continue. No, they were serious. They were that serious, and they were really, really, really wanting a compromise peace. They were desperate about that. But it was rejected by the Allied powers because it was a moment which was militarily favorable for the Central Powers, and they were not interested in settling now. So they went on, and then the Central Powers renewed these peace offers another 2 times.
Just listening from what you've been answering to that question, it seems as though a lot of the countries involved in the First World War are almost reluctantly involved because they seem to be vying for peace. They seem to be trying to negotiate peace and seem to be able to almost backtrack out of the conflict. For anyone who's studied history in the UK at least, we're continuously taught the First World War, the Second World War, and so on. And we're always told that the First World War starts with the assassination of the Duke. I forgot the guy's name now.
Franz Ferdinand.
That's it. Now, my question is for someone who's obviously an expert in this field and has studied this extensively, what is the truth behind that? Is it really as simple as one man's assassination led to a global conflict, or are there far more less obvious reasons, or reasons that have just been kind of expunged from the public record?
Oh, my goodness. Amar, you open a can of worms. Because I think there is no topic in history as intensely researched as the origins of the First World War and why it broke out. Maybe the Holocaust, but this is really, entire libraries are written on this book alone, and then we have the question: were the European structures wrong? And so basically something had to happen, and there was an international rivalry in a chaotical, anarchical state system. At some point, this imperialist rivalries had to produce this kind of war, or could it have gone well? And what was exactly the importance of the actors of July 1914, we'll say the policy makers in the European governments, and we'll say individual agencies, and 10 historians, ask them the same question and you will get 10 different answers. And I can only speak for myself. My interpretation is that the assassination of Francis Ferdinand started a chain reaction of wrong moves. We'll say there was not one wrong decision, but several wrong decisions made by policymakers. We'll say the first one was that the Austrians wanted to punish the Serbs because they said, well, the assassination was brokered by Serbia and we have to punish them. And we have to punish them by war if possible, but the Serbs may get backing from Russia, so we need German help to counterbalance that. And if Germany is involved against Russia, Russia will get help from France. So basically, the chain reaction was pretty clear what happens. But something like that had already happened in the Bosnian annexation crisis. Austria-Hungary had annexed Bosnia, which the Serbs thought have a claim because there were some Serbs living. And Serbia was backed by Russia. And at the end of the day, this Bosnian annexation crisis was ended in 1909 with a clear success for the Austrians and the Germans, because under German pressure, the Russians decided to back down. And this was only 5 years before the outbreak of the First World War. And I think in the July crisis 1914, they tried to do something very similar. The Austrians make a war against Serbia, punish Serbia, and Russia, under German pressure, stays neutral and let this happen. But Russia had rearmed in the meantime and was not ready to give way. And so basically, there's this, do you know the word brinkmanship? So basically, this was wrong-going brinkmanship. They tried a maneuver of brinkmanship, and it backfired. And then nobody in the July crisis 1914 was ready to accept a heavy diplomatic defeat. Instead of that, they moved forward, and at the end they said, to honor our alliances is at the end of the day more important for us than preserving European peace. And Lord George called that all powers slithered into the cauldron of war, whatever this means. But this means they made massive mistakes, and they were not ready to accept the disadvantage for stepping down, which would have been disadvantages, but not a disadvantage on the level of a world war.
Definitely. Just then, following on from the outbreak of the war, what is the importance of the failure of the, and I'm sure my pronunciation isn't going to be great, but what is the importance of the failure of the Schlieffen plan? The
Schlieffen plan.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the Schlieffen plan was this idea to concentrate the German powers in a two-front war, because it was pretty clear if a European war breaks out, France and Russia have an alliance, so Germany is sandwiched. If Germany splits its forces in one half here and one half there, they were not strong enough to bring a decision. And so from the beginning, it would have been clear this will be a long war of attrition. Because you start a war and you know you cannot bring a decision. This is utterly unattractive as a war plan. And so they decided we bring all of our forces, or the vast majority of all our forces, to one front, have the numerical superiority on one front, win there, and will bring then, after a quick victory, our forces to the other front and have probably at least numerical equality also on the other front. So this kind of made sense. And then the second thing is to go through neutral Belgium. This made kind of sense as well, because otherwise Germany would have been forced to attack the extremely heavily fortified French border. There was one fortress after the next. This would have meant practically to start the First World War with the Battle of Verdun. Basically, you start that and you run aground immediately. It was clear you will run aground immediately because the enemy is fortified, the enemy has machine guns and artillery and so on. This is unattractive. It is much better to come from behind, to encircle him, to avoid the frontal attack. So many elements of Schlieffen's plan made kind of sense. But of course, there were also very many nonsensical elements. For example, invading neutral Belgium brought the British in. And this was basically what capsized the entire German war plan. They had hoped until the end that Britain will stay neutral. And if that had happened, then the First World War would have ended very differently. This is, by the way, a British historian, Neil Ferguson, said Britain should have stayed neutral to focus on its empire, to keep the empire, and Germany would have then, won the Continental War. They would have been the dominant power on the continent. So who cares? They have anyway achieved that by the European Union. This is what Neil Ferguson said. well, this would have been a different Europe, because Germany is different as well now than it was then.
Definitely. Just then focusing on some of the German military figures, so like Hindenburg and Ludendorff, how are their strategies and their decisions that they make impact kind of the opinion or the perspective of the war? So like, as in, does do some of their defeats or victories help to radicalize the war effort or help to push people away from the war effort? Like, how much is the kind of temperament for the war actually measured by the success or defeat in the battlefield?
Well, let us first characterize maybe what Hindenburg and Ludendorff did during the First World War, and then answer the question. The first thing is, at the very beginning of the war, they became commanders on the Eastern Front, which was not well equipped with forces, because biggest part of the German army was fighting against France. So they had a relatively small army, the Ninth Army, to defend Eastern Prussia against the Russians. And the Russians attacked. At Hindenburg and Ludendorff were able at the end of August to achieve a major victory at the so-called Battle of Tannenberg. They annihilated an entire Russian army, despite the fact that next door was another Russian army, which did not help the Russian, the encircled Russian army, because they were hindered by the geography of Eastern Prussia. There was a chain of lakes, and so they could not intervene in time. It was a gamble, but it paid off. So they were already praised as a savior of Eastern Prussia. So enormous reputation from the start. Hindenburg and Ludendorff are the saviors of Eastern Prussia and strategical geniuses. There was a major military success. We have to say this was a really, really, it was a risky thing to try that, but it paid off. Then in August 1916, late August 1916, Hindenburg and Ludendorff became chief of staff and replaced Falkenhayn, against whom they had opposed all the time, because they thought that we are better equipped to lead Germany's armies. And they immediately started with radicalizing German take on the war. They called into force something called the Hindenburg program, and this is basically an enormous boost of German armament industries. And a lot of that was really ill-fated, because they built, for example, a lot of steel factories, and at the end they found out that they don't have the coals and so on to set them into motion. There was a lot of misallocation of resources thanks to this program, and it is also not that they pretended that Germany was behind it with everything, which was also not true. There was a lot of propaganda in that as well. But they tried to focus all forces of the German nation for the war effort. So there was a radicalization in Germany thanks to Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and both of them were in principle big favors, very favorable towards annexation. So they also politically had a very tough agenda, a very imperialist agenda. Why did they do that, the Hindenburg program and so on? This was basically a result of the Somme battle, because the Somme battle started on the 1st of July with an infantry attack, but it had really started with a 1-week artillery bombardment of the German lines. So basically, thousands of guns were shelling the German lines, and the Germans were dumbstruck, because they said, well, they have such a superiority in the production of ammunition and guns. they will squeeze us like a lemon in the press, and we have urgently to do likewise. So basically, they were afraid that British industry would continue doing something like the Somme battle, and they wanted to counterbalance it. And in the second part of the war, we have Hindenburg and Ludendorff as what I call in my book the center of the war party. Will say they are indeed mainly annexationist, and they fought also against the numerous other people in Germany who favored a compromise peace. Does that answer the question, kind of?
No, definitely. Just like you mentioned that there's this kind of internal conflict happening between those who perhaps want to see the end of the war and those who are advocating for a compromise peace. And I'm sure there are people who don't want there to be a war in the first place. How do those internal struggles impact Germany during the war? Like, as in, does the call for peace only begin at a particular period? Are the hardliners kind of radicalized by something, or kind of what's going on there?
Well, if we look very carefully towards what Germany did in the First World War, it starts very early on, because the Schlieffen plan failed, and then entire mobile warfare on the Western Front ran aground at the latest in after the First Battle of Ypres in November 1914. And then by then, German Chief of Staff was Erich von Falkenhayn, and he approached Reichskanzler von Bethmann-Hollweg, we'll say the political leader, and said, we will say the army cannot do it. We run aground and we have to fight against all the Entente powers who will mobilize their worldwide resources. So time is working against us. And a political solution is needed. We'll say, militarily, we cannot win. We need a political solution. Bethmann-Hollweg hated that. But then they start to try to find ways out of the war, and they offered separate peace to the Russians. Several times, even after the big defeats of the Russians in 1915, they offered the Russians separate peace. We don't want land, we don't want war indemnities, we want only peace with you. But Russia was bound towards its allies not to conclude a separate peace. And, from a Russian perspective, it would have been also very unfortunate leaving the war knowing that the British, the French, and the Italians will hate them for the eternity, to leave them alone with the Germans. And so they thought, we have to hang on. And so they did not react on that. We can say that this is also maybe one of the stories where European history went fundamentally in the wrong direction, if we see what happened with Russia. Because all this disaster, the split between Europe and Russia, also started in the First World War with the Russians, first the Tsar hanging on, not wanting a compromise peace. Then the Tsar had to step back, and then for a few months we had a liberal Russia. But also liberal Russia said, we want to continue the war on the side of our allies. They did not want to conclude peace with the Central Powers. And the war was by then so unpopular in Russia that Lenin and the communists could come to power, something which in normal times never would have happened. Because I think Lenin and the Bolsheviks were such a radical break with everything. Under normal circumstances and in normal times, they would have remained a small, bizarre political group which never had a chance to come to power. Only under the extraordinary circumstances of the First World War and this decision of the Russian government to hang on, they were able to come to power. But this is now speaking about Russia. Our topic is Germany.
Definitely. Just for 1 second, hanging on with Russia for a minute. Obviously, you spoke about how they're given, Germany gives them a number of separate pieces or attempts at coming to peace with Germany, with Russia. And Russia deny these because they've agreed with their allies not to negotiate a separate peace. But Russia does leave the First World War like 7 or 8 months before what is armistice date. So why does, like, what's going on there then? Because as far as kind of the history textbook goes, Russia signs a treaty in March 1918 and the end of First World War happens in November. So why does Russia leave the First World War early, and is that still honoring their allies, or is there something else going on?
Well, there were two revolutions in Russia in 1917. First, in March, the Tsar had to go. Russia became a kind of democracy. All that was, of course, very unstable because of the ongoing war. The liberal government and the leading person in the liberal government became later Kerensky, Alexander Kerensky, Minister of War, and for that reason, you hear very often the name Kerensky in this context. Decided to hang on, and they even started a very big offensive in 1917, the Kerensky offensive, which backfired. It did not work. It was a complete failure. And then basically Russia was militarily finally on its last leg, and it was a kind of very complicated internal situation because there were millions of refugees from the Russian retreat in 1915 in the big Russian cities in St. Petersburg and so on. So basically, there was kind of very difficult to control situation, very difficult, and also supply problems, all kind of disastrous developments. And then Lenin came to power in the so-called October Revolution in November 1917. They had a different calendar. And the first thing Lenin did after coming to power was to conclude an armistice and start peace negotiations with Germany, because Lenin had understood what Kerensky did not understand, that the Russian people did not want to continue to fight. And so the Russian people had one big requirement towards their government: stop the war. And if you don't stop the war, we hang you at the next letter. This was basically the mood. And Lenin understood that. And then he started peace negotiations. And these peace negotiations were in Brest-Litovsk, in today's Poland. And because of a very complex story, it became a very unfortunate peace for the Russians, for two reasons. First, the head of the Russian delegation was Leo Trotsky, and Leo Trotsky tried the very risky strategy of thinking that the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians would not resume hostilities if they don't accept that their condition. And the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians did that. But the real more important point was that inside the multinational Russian Empire, all the non-Russian nationalities were moving towards independence from Russia. So basically, the Russian Empire was falling apart in this moment and wanted independence. And there were basically links between, first, the national idea, so we are not Russian and we want to get rid of Russian domination. And the second thing is, we are not communists and we want to get rid of the communists. And basically, the Russians, being communists, were uniting two elements which were like a bomb, making the entire empire explode. And then, as a third and very important argument, we have the imperialism of the Germans. The Germans wanted to use this opportunity to split up the Russian Empire and to create a number of German-controlled satellite states. And even the German politicians who were in favor of a compromise peace, they said, well, why should we not use the historical opportunity to split up the Russian Empire, which was basically the Russians were conquerors for hundreds of years, and now there's a historical opportunity that all that is undone. Why should we stand in the way of it? We use this historical opportunity. So, and all that together brought the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, which was by then and in historiography always considered to be a piece of German imperialism. But look on a map of Brest-Litovsk and on a map of how borders in Eastern Europe look today, and you will find out that the borders of today are very similar, like the borders of Brest-Litovsk. It is not only German imperialism, there are also the two other factors.
No, definitely. Just moving beyond the military aspect of things and just kind of looking at the social political climate of Germany and kind of just the everyday person's sentiment or understanding of the war. What is kind of the social political climate of Germany, and how does that change during the First World War, and what impacts the people's sentiment? Are there particular events or incidences that make the population kind of go one way or the other?
Well, I would say, of course, a long war like the First World War, which caused basically 2 million German soldiers died on the battlefield. So, of course, there's an enormous element of wear. The longer the war goes, the bigger the losses are. Everybody starts to have a lost dear one in family, among family and friends, and all that pays a toll. But I evaluated also sources from people who lost sons on the front line, were completely broken fathers, and still supported that the war had to continue. It's very complicated, because I don't think that this traumatic experience alone make people stop. But there are a lot of other elements. For example, the German situation regarding food. Germany was a net importer of foodstuff in 1914, and most of the foodstuff they bought in, for example, in Russia or overseas, and all that stopped. Russia was an enemy, and Argentina, they could not get there because of the blockade. So basically, they had a lack of food from the start, but the reserves they had made this tolerable until, let's say, spring, mid-1916. So shortages were moderate and still acceptable. Things got much worse with, and also because of another factor which I want to mention, Germany used the neutrals to buy stuff on the world market. So basically, neutral Netherlands, neutral Denmark, neutral Norway, neutral Sweden. They basically, German companies bought over, let's say, Dutch middlemen on the world market stuff. And of course, the British saw that, and they saw that suddenly the Netherlands imported, let's say, 350% more of some stuff. This was surely not for domestic consumption. But they were unable to stop that. They were able to stop that only after the most important neutral, the United States of America, had entered the war. Then the British blockade became really rigid, and Germany could not anymore buy on the world market. And this was in 1917, and this bad harvest in 1916, which I mentioned already, led to the so-called turnip winter 1916, 1917, where German ration card could offer only a little bit over 800 calories a day. This is, of course, not even remotely sufficient. And then it increased a little bit, but from 1916 onwards, there was a very, very severe problem with nutrition in Germany and as well as in Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. So they did not really know how to feed the population in the long run. And I would say the internal mood was heavily influenced by that. And you see it also with other factors. For example, strikes. It was in the moment of the war breaking out, they said, now we have to stick together. All Germans have to stick together to face the danger from our enemies. There were practically no strikes in Germany in 1914 and 1915, pretty close to zero. And then in 1916, strikes are restarting. And in 1917 and 1918, it becomes big and bigger. And in 1918, we had strikes also linked with peace demonstration. And so there were hundreds of thousands and even millions of people on the streets demonstrating for peace and against the war. So we'll say the internal situation showed massive cracks, and that had also a strategic implication, because knowing that the home front is cracking, you cannot go on forever. You have to bring that to a conclusion, because if you don't do that, you have a revolution at home. And after things happening in Russia, this was a writing on the wall. Well, it happened in Russia, but it may happen also here. So that our government is overthrown, something like that. And this put them under pressure. And this was also one of the reasons of the big offensive of 1918 to bring that to a quick conclusion, because Army Command, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and the German population, all of them were thinking the only way out of the war is winning it. Because we offered now peace so many times. The enemy will not conclude peace with us. The only way to get out of the war is to win. This is basically what they thought. We have to win that. And this is the result may look similar, but it is a very different story that you say Imperial Germany hang on to conquer Europe, or Imperial Germany hang on to get peace under acceptable conditions. And when you ask now what were acceptable conditions, the majority of the Reichstag, will say, of the German parliament, the parties in the German parliament wanted, it's a very minimum, of course, that Germany had not to make territorial concessions. So they wanted to get out of the war with everything they owned before. I would say that is the real core message, and where basically Germany was not ready to negotiate. They said, no, we will not give up any square inch of our own territory, but the rest is negotiable. But that was never put on the test, because the German war party could always say, well, the enemy is not negotiating, and for that reason we have to move on with the war. And the peace party said, we want to negotiate, and the war party said, with whom? The enemy is not negotiating. And this is basically the internal mechanics in Germany. Had the German peace party had some evidence that the enemy is ready to negotiate, the power balance in Germany would have capsized.
Just shifting to then the longer term implications, how do you think Germany's experience in World War I influenced its approach then towards the Second World War? Obviously, anyone who's listening who studied history at GCSE in England is always taught about the Treaty of Versailles and how there are restrictions on on the number of like 6 battleships and 100,000 men and relinquishing its overseas territories, and there's all these restrictions that are put on Germany, and the narrative very much becomes about the Treaty of Versailles and how that is central to the kind of the bridge between both the wars. But from your perspective, and for someone who's obviously studied this, how does the First World War influence Germany's approach then to the Second World War?
So one thing is certain: without the First World War, no Second World War, because the First World War created in every aspect the necessary preconditions for the Second World War, and without that, and for that reason, George F. Kennan, an American diplomat and historian, had called the First World War the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, would say, without that, you cannot explain the rest. And yes, after the First World War, Germany was, until 1933, there was a so-called Weimar Republic. But also the Weimar Republic was revisionist. Revisionist in the sense that they said, we don't accept the Versailles Treaty. And the Versailles Treaty was only signed because the Allied powers had pushed a shotgun at the German chest and clicked the trigger. And then they had to sign it because they knew if we don't sign it, they will invade our country, which would have happened. And in Germany, we had really a group of people, even social democrats, who said, we don't sign that. And if they had not signed it, this was basically what Trotsky had tried in Brest-Litovsk, not to sign it. And the result was that the Germans and Austro-Hungarians had basically sent troops forward. So basically invaded large parts of Russia to force the Russians to sign it. And that would have happened in 1919 in Germany as well. So the more reasonable people like Matthias Erzberger, center party politician, he said, let's sign that, because afterwards probably we will be able to make some revisions. So basically a level-headed man. And so they signed the Versailles Treaty, but they were always interested in changing it. So what did they want to change? Of course, the German army wanted to be bigger than 100,000 men, especially because 100,000 men was originally the beginning of a universal rearmament. So, but the French did not rearm, the British did not rearm, and so they said, we are the only one who rearmed, and as long as that is the case, we want to rearm as well. So the army wanted to rearm. But I think the key argument, and they wanted, of course, a revision of the border and of the eastern border towards Poland. There was very unfortunate settlements with Danzig, a 98% German town, being a free city, so that Poland has a harbor. So a lot of things which are also were not very sensical. So they wanted to revise that. And also the democratic parties wanted to revise that. But revision has not to come automatically with the Second World War. You can also try to make a peaceful revision. And the key, and I think the most important part of the Versailles Treaty, which stopped more positive outcomes, were the financial settlements. All those reparation questions and the unclearness about the amount of money, and then those astronomical figures where everybody knew that Germany will never be able to pay that. Never. And so basically not giving the young German democracy a hand to establish itself fully. And then a lot of other unfortunate things, for example, the German hyperinflation, which was also caused by war in the way Imperial Germany had financed the First World War. So there was a lot of lack of inner stability. And at the end of the day, I would say still there is also an element of very bad luck, because without a maniac like Adolf Hitler, I think Germany would not have embarked on this catastrophic way of revising the Versailles, or not revising the Versailles Treaty was only an excuse for Hitler, but by redrawing the entire map of Europe, because even other leading Nazi politicians like Hermann Göring and so on wanted at the end a more cautious policy. So there was an element of bad luck that we had this kind of catastrophic figure like Adolf Hitler, who was, this kind of crossover between a genius and an incredibly evil man. And once he was in power, Germany was doomed.
Yeah. Just then, kind of getting towards the last few questions. If you would have to boil down why Germany lost the First World War into 5 main reasons, what would they be and why?
So maybe, the best would have been to avoid that from happening. But that is true for all nations in 1914. Then the key argument which I always make is keep the Americans out. Okay, the Americans delivered war material to Britain and France, and this is also tough nut, tough pill to swallow, that you say our boys die on the battlefield in France because Americans deliver ammunition. This does not go well. Basically, they are helping our enemies in a massive way. But still, it would have been in the German interest to accept that, because you cannot change this, and trying to change that makes no sense. So avoiding the Americans to come in, then the entire thing would have gone differently. I don't know how differently, but there is a big likelihood that Germany would not have lost the war. They would have there would have been a kind of compromise piece. If that would have made Europe a better place or not, who knows? It's counterfactual history. And we don't have to debate that, even if I think probably it would have been a better place. But this is open. And basically, we can leave it here, because I could not now make also other examples of things going wrong, but the 2 central points are already made. Not starting the war, and if the war started, at least keeping the Americans out. Of course, we could make a 3rd point, keep the English out. But that is already a very tough one, because even without Belgium, it may have been that at some point Britain enters the war to prevent the European balance being completely changed in German favor, so that they would have intervened to help the French and the Russians.
Just the last 2 questions, and they're a little bit more light-hearted than perhaps what we've been discussing. But if you could have a conversation with any figure from the First World War, or even prior, obviously from the area that you studied, who would it be and what would you ask them?
Well, I have the strong feeling that if I were meeting anybody from, for example, from the German leadership in the First World War, it would probably be a conversation about between 2 deaf-mute people, because whatever I would probably say, well, don't do that, and don't do that, and I think they would not listen to me. And because they were acting and they thought they have good reasons. I would be interested, for example, to speak with Erich von Falkenhayn, because I wrote a biography on him. And I would be curious to see if he is exactly as I imagined him. That would be a professional interest. I would be interested to see Leo Trotsky, the Russian politician who was had in Brest-Litovsk, who was an extremely smart and charismatic individual, but also somebody, yes, a mass murderer. So we are talking about very bad people here. And there are many other interesting people. For example, the British pacifist Bertrand Russell would be interesting to meet. It would be very interesting to meet, for example, Lloyd George, who I think was in many aspects fascinating man. And I could make a long list. And what would I discuss with them? It's on the individuals.
That's a fair answer. And I guess it also depends on what drink that you're sharing with them as well, right? That will also influence the conversation. My last question then, is during your research, was there any kind of fact or piece of trivia that you discovered that you just didn't expect? Was there something that you researched that you came across and you had to almost double or triple check to make sure it was true because of how perhaps surprising it may have been?
Okay, I make things like that happen. And I make one example, which is a little bit outside of my field of political and military history. Because at some point I stumbled over the fact that, in the First World War, they invented poisonous gas. And they started to use that from 1915 onwards. And at some point, they made, after the war, they made tests with poisonous gas, more precisely with something which was called mustard gas or lost. And they found out that this can be used as an anti-cancer treatment. And if you are unlucky and you have cancer now, there is a so-called chemotherapy. And the chemotherapy is built on similar and comparable material as poisonous gas, this particular poisonous gas in the First World War.
Wow. Okay, I never knew that. I just want to double check. I've got through all of the questions that I wanted to ask you. Is there anything that you think is worth mentioning or anything that you think we've missed over that you just want to kind of say before we wrap up?
Yeah. Amar, I wrote this book, and this book has 550 pages. Of course, if we cover every aspect, then we probably need a week or so. And I think for 1 hour, we spoke already about a lot.
And that's the end of another intriguing podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating this podcast. If you're passionate about the work I'm doing and want to support it, consider becoming a paid YouTube member to unlock some cool features or join our Patreon community. You can find the links in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Bye!